Good afternoon. Thanks to all of you for joining me this afternoon for a preview of my book, Comic Belles Lettres, Genealogies of Humor and Satire in Anglo-American Literature, 1711 to 1856. Thanks to LSU Press for hosting this book launch, and thanks to Corey Calabria for moderating. My talk today will mostly offer a summary of the book's introduction so that important theories, premises, and background can be discussed, which can then lead to questions and discussion about specific texts and authors I investigate. The study divides into three main parts. The first develops the English background. The second investigates in detail specific American texts. The third delves into the antebellum print archive, first to show how comic belles lettres as an aesthetic encompasses historical figures as well as fictional characters, and then to explore how antebellum critics and commentators employed concepts from the aesthetic. The impetus for the book started with a research question that should intrigue all scholars of American humor and American culture. What did American satire, amiable or caustic, look like before Mark Twain, Mount Rainier in a metaphoric Cascade skyline, dominates the literary landscape? The usual answer starts with Mark Twain and then looks backwards for antecedents, a tactic implicit in scholarship by founders of American humor as a discipline, such as Jeanette Tandy, Constance Rourke, and Walter Blair. In addition, their work makes an assumption. Various kinds of humor index differences in nation-states. Walter Blair and Hamlin Hill's influential America's Humor from Poor Richard to Doonesbury also betrays its allegiance to the idea that nation-states possess a distinctive humor signifying a distinctive character. Blair and Hill's History, the standard for the field, features antebellum writers using vernacular speech in either a New England style, for example, Seba Smith, or in a frontier style, for example, Johnson J. Hooper, the latter of which are touted as the predecessors of Mark Twain. This emphasis establishes an American comic tradition that insists on vernacular speech anchoring a so-called native typology meant to emphasize how the tradition breaks from British comic authors and their styles while implying something wholly new, a standalone American literature. This claim for something new, distinguished from British literature, is perhaps most clearly on display in the title of Blair's solo effort, Native American Humor, even as it effectively extinguishes, or at least obscures, any indigenous culture. The comic belles lettres aesthetic presented in the book implies something else altogether: no use of vernacular speech within a transnational context. It is these differences that makes belles lettres a tag useful for my study. Both features have been mapped onto the field of American humor studies by Judith Yarros Lee's Matter of Empire thesis. Lee's phrase Matters of Empire names, quote, the unequal transnational political relationships shaping the basic components and rhetorical conventions of comic traditions in the United States. Her thesis assumes an overarching American comic tradition, one that encompasses the usual subdivisions, such as vernacular, as it sorts examples into three categories. The vernacular becomes post-colonial, a disjunction and rejection from a second category, colonial continuity, which highlights a heritage of British comic writing. A third category entangles, quote, with the rise of the U.S. imperium and implies a parallel comic tradition reflecting assertion of that power, the neo-colonial. Comic belles lettres exemplifies colonial continuity, demonstrating what Lee has posited about a significant portion of American comic artifacts. The value, quote, the value of reframing America's genteel comic tradition in terms of continuity with its colonial heritage. My project shows how conceptualizing comic belles lettres as an aesthetic within a transnational context restores the historical reality that two important versions of comic artifacts, comic belles lettres and the vernacular so-called native tradition, existed side by side in the antebellum literary marketplace. The book offers this question to the research question, implying a necessary revision of the antebellum portion of Blair and Hill's history of the American comic tradition. My investigation adapts Michel Foucault's archaeological method of analysis, using comic belles lettres to name an aesthetic, one part of what I call the comic, an example of Foucault's concept discursive formations. Like medical discourse, the comic as a discursive formation encompasses a wide range of expression and knowledge about comic artifacts and comic laughter. The comic as a discourse theoretically encompasses not just the comic artifacts of fine arts, literature, and folklore, but also a manifold of everyday behaviors, such as banter, teasing, joking relationships, in the service of producing a specific response, comic laughter. As a distinctive discursive formation, the comic has two aspects. First, a set of practices that may be everyday and formal, or may instead be artistically formal in conception and execution, in either case generating comic artifacts. Second, a complementary theoretical aspect, one that can be logically separated from commentary about art in general or aesthetics. The comic is discourse creating and denoting what the ancient Greeks called the domain of the laughable. Laughable signifying anything that prompts or induces laughter of all kinds, not simply derisory. Theoretically situated within the domain of the laughable and its larger discourse of and about comic artifacts and comic laughter, comic belles lettres as an aesthetic must maintain its own boundaries so that it can operate as a subformation. So that within this theoretical framework, the question becomes, what constitutes the discursive practices by which the community of comic belles lettres writers, first in England and then in antebellum America, establishes its presence and exerts an aesthetic authority? Answering that question provides the means for presenting a different literary history of antebellum comic writing that currently exists by establishing English precedents and then focusing on antebellum America in order to demonstrate the wide dispersion of comic belles lettres across the specified time frame. The background in England begins with Addison and Steele's essays, mostly in The Spectator, about humor, comic butts, and what they call pleasant raillery, that is, amiable satire. Their idea about an amiable satire in particular changes the critical conversation that starts with Plato and Aristotle, namely the centuries-old emphasis that legitimate comic artifacts should laugh at, and so might correct, social faults, bad manners, and corrosive morals. Addison and Steele's idea of pleasant raillery offers the possibility of a friendlier version of satire that writers might employ to create comic characters in comic stories. The Spectator's style of comic writing at the beginning of the 18th century merges into the philosophical emphasis on sympathy or fellow feeling as a moral sentiment, famously outlined at mid-century by Adam Smith in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Addison-Steele emphasis on amiable satire and Smith's emphasis on sympathy as the best moral sentiment to promote community and social cohesion provided the aesthetic and philosophical scaffolding for the cultural phenomenon of a new kind of hero whose moral stature is signaled by his displays of fellow feeling, which typically manifest as blushes or tears. The result is what becomes known as the cult of sensibility. The signature character for the type is Mr. Harley in Henry Mackenzie's novel The Man of Feeling. I argue that the aesthetic of comic belles lettres produces the comic equivalent of the man of feeling, the comic gentleman. On the British side, 18th century versions abound. Parson Adams in Henry Fielding's The History of the Adventures of Joseph Andrews and of his friend Mr. Abraham Adams, as well as Dr. Harrison and Major Bath in his Amelia. Commodore Trunnion in Tobias Smollett's The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Uncle Toby and Tristram Shandy in Lawrence Sterne's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy Gentleman, as well as Parson York in Sterne's A Sentimental Journey, and Dr. Primrose in Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield, a tale supposed to be written by himself. This comic man of feeling is a peculiar kind of gentleman with elaborate comic abilities. He's either the friendly humorist who indulges the foibles of others, or the amiable satirist who amiably ridicules moral foibles or possibly even some forms of vice. Either attitude implies sympathy mixed with variable measures of ridicule. If amiability with minimal ridicule gives way to a harsher ridicule, as the targets become more damaging to communal health, the comic gentleman should nevertheless always chastise with benevolence as motive for his comic critique. Even wielding a caustic style, the satirist operating within the comic belles lettres aesthetic should proceed with a proper temperament of fellow feeling, dispensing comic tough love for the butt of the satire, not indulging spleen venting against it. The 18th century's cult of sensibility as cultural background, developed in Part 1, is crucial to establishing the genealogy of the comic gentleman. In addition, the first part traces out a theme of doubling, for the comic belles lettres aesthetic presents a persistent structuring of doubleness that manifests as apparent contradiction. The logic of its apparent contradiction can be figured as the double helix that unites two strands of DNA. The aesthetic's fundamentally doubled move enables discursive travel in two opposite directions. Humor others to create a community based on fellow feeling and sympathy, a mirthful chorus that tolerates with a view to a symbolic hug. Satirize others to insist on the need for a better community based on better behavior, chastising with a view to a symbolic scolding. The power of comic belles lettres resides in the way it twists these two opposing comic attitudes around each other to produce its aesthetic code for a genealogy of comic gentlemen. Three concepts result from this theme of doubling: the split self gesture, speculative sympathy, and imagined comic community. Once again, the split self gesture, speculative sympathy, and imagined comic community. Let me elaborate. Within the comic belles lettres model, two humorists contemplate with proper sympathy each other's differences, such that they both become committed to tolerating, humoring those differences in a comic fellowship. A psychic division precedes this tolerance in the body politic, for the aesthetic's new school modern humorist divides into both joke teller and comic butt in an act of self-deprecation that acknowledges one's own foolishness, the split self gesture. The resulting consciousness provides the cognitive and emotional ground for the modern humorist to uphold the liberal humanist view of individuality. He or she tolerates the eccentricities of his or her fellow citizens through a speculative sympathy that contemplates and accepts the eccentric other. Speculative because this sympathy has a forensic function, metaphorically on the lookout for eccentric others. Theoretically, this modern humorist, the comic gentleman, expands the definition of individuality by accepting eccentricities with amiable laughter. Such laughter operates as the sign of the liberal humanist's affective reaction to difference, rather than panic, melancholy, or nostalgia. The dynamic of doubling has a third level that includes the implied reader, enjoined to laugh amiably over the eccentricities of the humorist represented in the story world of the narrative, potentially including the narrator as well as the implied author. Doubling at this level implies an imagined comic community. This theme of doubling manifests as a persistent display of liminality, ambivalence, and ambiguity, exemplified by the contradiction of the comic gentleman being an amiable satirist practicing pleasant raillery, the aesthetic manifesting a double helix structure at multiple levels. The first part also investigates debates about masculinity in 18th century England and 19th century America, because amiable satire from an amiable humorist can be delivered by a comic lady as well as a comic gentleman. The comic belles lettres construction of a writer's or character's temperament establishes a feminizing quality endemic to the aesthetic that can be read as undermining its apparent gender bias, an intersection with the cult of sensibility. The affiliation of the comic gentleman with the man of feeling uncovers profound questions about what it means to be a gentleman and what counts as masculine and feminine behavior. The representative figure of the aesthetic, the comic gentleman, exhibits both feminine and masculine characteristics that roughly correspond to the two major comic modes, the humorous and the satiric. The humorous employs the sentimental and stereotypically feminine qualities of sympathy, tolerance, and benevolence. As a person humors foibles and eccentricities, laugh with the other. The satiric exhibits qualities stereotypically associated with the masculine, aggression, scorn, and ridicule, as a person derides vices, laugh at the other. The role of the amiable satirist dramatized in the guise of the comic gentleman is introduced with Joseph Addison's Mr. Spectator. Sir Roger de Coverley and Mr. Spectator initiate the genealogy with Mr. Spectator's laughing yet warm treatment of Sir Roger de Coverley. Sir Roger is a ludicrous object, a figure worthy of being humored with tolerant laughter. Mr. Spectator as a comic gentleman not only can be read as Addison and Steele's alter ego, but also as necessarily constructing the implied reader as yet another amiable satirist with the virtues of a witty yet tolerant gentleman or genteel woman, who also humors Sir Roger, creating an imagined comic community of liberal humorists. American writers in the antebellum period are heirs to the British tradition of comic men of feeling, one kept very much relevant by William Thackeray's series of lectures given in England, Scotland, and America, collected and published in 1853 as the English humorist of the 18th century. Thackeray's portraits of 11 well-known authors, plus one painter, provide proof of the long-lived viability of the comic Belles Lettres aesthetic. Thackeray's lectures in 1853 present an excellent example of the elastic nature of the concept humorous within the aesthetic. Despite his calling the authors and one painter humorists, Thackeray's list includes several writers known for their burlesques, lampoons, and satires, and also includes two of the most celebrated satirists of the 18th century, Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. In addition, the painter William Hogarth is known for his social satire dramatized in his series of paintings. Thackeray's lectures thus provide a gallery of possible comic gentlemen who exhibit in a variety of ways the genuine camaraderie of amiable humors. The second part of the book examines a set of antebellum fictional narratives. Washington Irving's The Sketchbook and Bracebridge Hall, or The Humorist, a medley, leads the list as the pivotal heirs to the Spectator style of comic writing. His characters, Squire Bracebridge and Mr. Geoffrey Crayon, the American counterparts to Sir Roger and Mr. Spectator. In the early 19th century, the genealogy of comic belles lettres resembles a baton handed off in a transatlantic relay team, as Washington Irving's Mr. Crayon in The Sketchbook follows hard upon Jane Austen's Mr. Wentworth in Persuasion, in that both characters can usefully be tagged as later generation comic men of feeling. Irving's Squire Bracebridge proves pivotal in this regard, with his concern for what constitutes a proper masculinity, as well as for the consequences of advancing industrialization on the rural districts in England. The set of comic narratives suggests a range of uses for the comic gentleman, with an emphasis on the one hand of amiability and self-deprecation, and on the other a potential for dispensing satire, both amiable and not so amiable. After Washington Irving's The Sketchbook and Bracebridge Hall, I turn to Donald Mitchell's The Fudge Papers, which offers a second look at the figure of the comic gentleman as bachelor seen in Irving's Geoffrey Crayon. Next is Frederic Cozzens's The Sparrowgrass Papers, which gives readers a comic gentleman snugly ensconced in a happy marriage. Harriet Beecher Stowe's character Augustine St. Clair in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Nathaniel Hawthorne's Miles Coverdale in the Blithedale romance provide contrasting examples, the zenith and nadir of how the comic gentleman might function as an amiable satirist with sympathy and moral sentiment. The third part of the book widens the scope of the investigation by taking a close look at how historical actors have employed comic belles lettres discourse in a variety of non-fictional discursive practices, editorial persona, periodical columns and reviews of books, to analyze William Thackeray as a satirist, to investigate how the American editor Lewis Gaylord Clark used it to organize editorial features in his magazine, the New York Knickerbocker, and to understand how a variety of antebellum commentators used comic belles lettres discourse to theorize about satire, humor, wit, and comic laughter. Each endeavor by historical actors displays the discursive space of comic belles lettres and tests its regime of truth. The study concludes with discussions of important topics within the comic belles lettres aesthetic: satire as metaphoric mirror, sympathy or fellow feeling as an element of both humor and satire, pastoral as an artistic hedge against industrializing capitalism, the deportment of a gentleman, the potential for a woman satirist, laughter as a body-sourced affect. Thank you so much for listening. Corey will moderate the question and answer now.
Hi, Jim. Thank you so much for that presentation. And I want to thank everyone as well for tuning in today. How this is going to work is if you've got a question for Jim, please just put it in the chat and I will ask it live. Jim can't see you, so it's important that you put it here, and I'll spread the word. So I actually, Jim, I'd actually like to start with something that you said early on. You mentioned that your book unfolds, I'm going to quote you, a different literary history of antebellum American comic writing than currently exists by establishing English precedents. So I wanted to start by kind of asking, we have this popular notion that American humor, maybe like everything else, kind of exists in a vacuum, if I'm mistaken, and if I'm not mistaken. And I'd like you, if you don't mind, to talk to me a little bit about maybe the broader traditions of what we consider American humor.
Yeah, thanks for that, Corey. You're highlighting what I think is one of the important facets of the book with this transnational context. And right, it turns out that when people were putting together the people I named, like Constance Rourke and Jeanette Tandy, Walter Blair, Hamlin Hill, the first three in particular, though they're writing in the 20s and 30s, and um, they're really very self-conscious about thinking about how American humor essentially pinpoints something very American in our character as a people. And it's interesting because what they're really doing is picking up on things that the British were talking about 100 years before that. So early in the 19th century, when British writers and critics are looking at what is this new American literature or attempts to establish new American literature, it's the humor that they singled out. And they said, oh, that's what looks really different. So, quote, that's really American. And it was very much tied in with the frontier and the westward expansion of the United States early in the 19th century. So it's a long-standing notion that's going on, and it's just something that has continued. One of my favorite epigrams is that inertia is the greatest force in the universe, and I think that's what we're seeing, is that there was this inertia before it. It wasn't like people didn't make comparisons or something like that, but I think in terms of, and especially in American, studies has been going on for some time with a more transnational approach. But American humor, the studies of American humor has been more fixated on this idea. Again, because I suggest it's been going on for quite a long time. And I think that it's, Judith Lee's comment about idea about matters of empires really has opened the door, in my opinion, to thinking more broadly about the context for certainly this kind of writings. The frontier's there still. It's not that it has gone away. But as I said, we have to realize that there's these two things happening at the same time.
Thank you for that. James Long, who, for those of you who don't know, is one of our acquiring editors here at LC Press, he let me know that this book has kind of a long backstory, and I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. The long backstory is that I think I started working on this about 10 or 12 years ago. What happened was, I got onto this idea that there's this. For me, it was really interesting because I did my dissertation on Mark Twain and frontier and vernacular writing and all the comic stuff that happened out of that. And so that was what I grew up in as a scholar. And so at a certain point, I realized, wait, there's this other thing. And when I started to investigate it, and like I said, the research question really was, well, what was, Mark Twain just kind of owns everything in American humor studies post-Civil War. What's happening before? And once I started investigating, I kept finding all kinds of things. And so the book got really big, so big that I couldn't get anyone to publish it all as one thing. And so part of it got separated off and into a focus just on Fanny Fern, the well-known uh, pseudonym for Sarah Willis Parton, who was quite a force in the 50s and 60s. And so that's a whole book on itself to sort of demonstrate that it's not, even though it's comic gentlemen, as I would try to make clear, there are comic ladies too about that. So it's something that I've been working on for quite a long time, and it in a way it just sort of took over because, as I say, every time I investigated, I would find more things. A lot of them are not well known anymore, but they were popular in their in their own time, and that's why I think that's another interesting facet of the book is that those writers like Donald Mitchell or Frederic Cozzens, I can link them up with Hawthorne and Stowe, and so you have this canonical writers as well as people who are popular in their day who fit into this aesthetic.
Yeah, I can only imagine how much sort of research went into this. I mean, just as a layperson who doesn't know a lot about this topic, in my mind, American humor starts with Mark Twain and then that's it,
Yeah,
right? But there's
right,
obviously so
right.
much that's like, 100 years or more, right, into the kind of American project. So like obviously there's so much more before then. I wanted to ask you some things that during your
Just
research
us.
process that you found surprising.
Well, I think the first thing is how much was there, to tell you the truth. The other thing for me was that I didn't appreciate at first. I latched onto to Washington Irving early on as the bridge, as I some mention and use that metaphor. He's the bridge between the British writers and the other American writers, in part because it's obvious enough when the sketchbook came out, all sorts of critical people said, "Oh yeah, he's this guy's writing like the Spectator again." And some people thought that was a good thing, and some people didn't think it was a good thing. And the people who didn't think it was a good thing, this is the other thing about the American humor and just American culture project is you have a coterie of writers, which people who include publishers or famous writers. Herman Melville is probably the best example of this. And they have this self-appointed tag as they call themselves Young America. And their whole thing is, we're going to write like Americans. We're not going to write like British. So when they saw Irving doing his thing, they're like, well, I mean, he's just doing this British part for that. And that's true more in sketchbook. But when you read Bracebridge Hall, a medley of humorists, and once that I saw that title, that subtitle, medley of humorists, I said, well, I have to look at this too. And it turns out he's much more. He's not nearly as friendly in there. And there's some important political satire, I think, that's in that second book. And so you see him evolving somewhat, and he just becomes a really good example of amiable humor, particularly in the first book, not so amiable humor in the second book, so that Jeffrey Crayon's voice is significantly different. And the view that the reader gets of Squire Bracebridge, which is still, 90% positive, but there's this other part where he doesn't really, his whole hobby horse is to think about merry old England and isn't it a shame that we're losing it in the face of industrialization. But his politics are actually fairly reactionary in there in terms of his attitude toward the lower classes. And so that's something that I didn't know about. And I don't think people think of Irving that way very much. And for me, that was a very big surprise. And also Stowe. Coming across Augustine St. Clair in teaching that book, I realized at a certain point that he fits into this aesthetic, and that was another thing I didn't see coming.
Yeah, we have a comment here from James Long, which is that most people know Washington Irving for things like Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but the sketchbook and Irving's work in general is much stranger than readers might suspect, which I'm guessing you also found in your research.
Right, I think that's a fair comment because again, if you look at the scholars, the older scholars that I'm referring to, when they look at Washington Irving, what do they talk about? Legend of Sleepy Hollow, right?
Mhm.
And Rip Van Winkle. So And that because that fits the vernacular story, and that's what Blair and Hill, that's what they look at. They don't really, when you look at the sketchbook, that's that's just a small percentage of the sketchbook. My focus is not on the whole sketchbook either, but it focuses on, there's a whole set of sketches, the Christmas holidays at Bracebridge Hall that Jeffrey Crayon gets invited to. There's 4 or 5 of them, and that unit is where you really see this initial development of Crayon as this gentleman, comic gentleman, and Bracebridge is a comic gentleman as well. He's very amiable, and he's a good guy in a lot of ways. He's like very much like the those set of British writers or British characters that I rattled off at one point. He really fits into there very much. And so, Irving that's what he wants to do. It's why the book was so popular. He sold a ton of books, and people, for one of the very first times that the Brits said, "Oh yeah, maybe the Americans are onto something here." And so there's this interesting split about in the scholastic commentary about, well, he's not really American, and that's not a really good thing. He's too British.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, he's early enough in American humor that the metaphor becomes this: he's the headwaters of American humor. And so he's both. That's part of that doubleness and liminality that I referred to.
For those of us who aren't familiar, could you tell us a little bit about
Okay, can you
sketchbook,
put it here?
and maybe that could also give us a sense of a comic belle lettre?
Well, like I said, the sketchbook is it's really those set of essays that Irving published them as a unit. He really, sort of got on to doing that. The rest of it is, it's a travel book, and travel books were always a big deal in the 19th century and before that. Um, that was something that a literate gentleman in particular, could go somewhere and, sort of see the sights and write them up. It might be he wrote letters back to a newspaper or something like that. And people who, in those days, if you went 10 or 15 miles from your house, that was a big deal. So if you could read, that was a kind of way to, from your armchair, to travel, itself. And that's what the sketchbook really is. He's got Jeffrey Crayon sort of wandering around. He's in London, of course. He goes to certain places in London. He wanders around in the countryside, and that's when he gets hooked up with the Bracebridges. But he also sees. It's interesting. He sees a family of they're British minor nobles, and they have the way that Crayon talks about them. They're clearly this very Addisonian, amiable British nobility who kind of represent what Irving really wants to show is the best of English nobility. They're very friendly to everybody. They're friendly to each other. They're genial. They're the sort of template for Irving's warmth toward the British, and that was part of the reason that the book sold so well. Of course, is because he was very
Mhm.
friendly to what was going on in Britain, and this mattered to a certain extent because not only the War of 1812, had finished a few years before, but the British polity was, I mean, there was a lot of serious, there were riots and people, there was a famous massacre, the Peterloo massacre that happened post Waterloo. And so there was a lot of turmoil in Britain from 1815 to 1820, 21, 22. And that was something that you see more in that's one of the big differences between Sketchbook and Bracebridge Hall. So Irving, it happens to be there when all this stuff is happening. He's there during the Napoleonic Wars, and he sees this trouble with the lower orders, if you will, the working class folks. There's a famine that's going on, and he sees all of this and puts it into the Bracebridge Hall book. And so again, I think that's something that, people know the sketchbook, they don't really know Bracebridge Hall. And so, like I said, I think that's something that would be interesting to other scholars of American culture, in particular.
If you're just tuning in, we are talking with James E. Caron, who wrote a new book called Comic Belle Lettre. If you got a question for Jim, please put it in the chat and I will ask live. I've got a couple more collected here for you, Jim, and then we'll call it a day. But I did want to ask you about one of your epigraphs, which is from Frederic Cozzens, who you talk about in the second part of your book, if I'm not mistaken. And the epigraph is from the Sparrowgrass Papers, and it goes, "Good humor is sympathetic." I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about maybe the context in which Cozzens means this, and if sympathy shows up as a theme in your research, and if so, how?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In one way, it's when we think about somebody, you think about the phrase, "Oh, let's humor the guy." Let's
Mm,
humor him. He's okay. Which means that we know you're a little odd or wacky, or maybe more than a little odd and wacky. It was like, well, we're not going to worry about. We're going to humor it. We're going to tolerate it, and that's just another form of sympathy. And one of the things that I developed, which I again, in a sense, didn't really understand at the very beginning, was this whole business about the comic man of feeling. Um, or the man of feeling in the comic, and then understanding that what I was talking about, this gentleman humorist and satirist, was a comic version of the man of feeling. And the man of feeling is, as I try to highlight real quickly, is a big phenomenon in mid 18th century British writing. Mackenzie's book, which was published in 1771, becomes this. There's a certain chicness about knowing it, and apparently in upper classes that if you were a good moral person, you behaved as he did, which is to say you were so sympathetic to people's troubles that you often cried.
mm,
That it's a little becomes a little bit of a joke because Mr. Harley cries like dozens of times in the book, which is not very long. But
mm,
the thing is that it becomes a thing it's a moment, and that's why all those other fellows that I was writing, some books like Fielding's books were even before Mackenzie's, but there's this whole cluster of books that, especially in the back half of the 18th century, that create these kind of characters who are a little bit, Uncle Toby in Tristram Shandy, is maybe the best example. He rides his hobby horse. He's interested in his little war games and things, and he's a little bit strange, but we don't mind him. We still
mm,
think he's really a good guy. He's treated with a certain amount of ridicule, but not a lot. So we humor him, and there's a little bit of sympathy for whomever he is. The real link is, as I mentioned, is Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, which is published a little bit earlier. It's 1759. And that is a real important book, philosophical book, ethical book in the Scottish Enlightenment and Enlightenment in general. It really lays out the argument for how a true gentleman, a humanist, should behave to his fellow citizens. And for Smith, he really argues that that is what creates community. That's the thread that binds all people together, is that you have a certain tolerance, you sympathize. The phrase that he used in his book is called fellow feeling. And once you see that he uses that phrase, you understand that sympathy and or fellow feeling, those phrases are all over the place, and it's just a big, big deal. And the book tries to show that that doesn't go away, and in fact, it lasts all the way up to Frederic Cozzens. Now to come back to your question,
mm,
Cozzens is writing his book in the early 1850s, and what I see is that by the time we get to that point in history, and we cross the Atlantic, we're over in America, these ideas that people like Smith and writers like Fielding, Mackenzie, those guys at Stern, all of those guys, that has become this aesthetic that is so obvious to some people that they don't even think about. They don't need to refer to anybody else for so much. They just sort of draw on it like you have a well in a water table, and it's just like, well, this is of course good humor and amiable laughter and being friendly and having that kind of laughter And that's the thing too, is to realize is that you've got, on the one hand, laughter is so for so long was always like, well, we were making fun of people, we're mocking them, we're ridiculing them.
Hmm.
And that's the big difference, right? That Addison and Steele show up. They say, no, it could be this thing too. And so there's this other aesthetic that develops. And so for Cozzens, when you get to his story, it's another interesting find for me. I never heard of Frederick Cozzens or the Sparrowgrass Papers, but it's this really charming little tale about a family that moves out of New York City because they want to be in the countryside and they want to raise their children in the countryside. And Mr. Sparrowgrass has aspirations to be a poet. He's always writing stuff or he's always quoting poets, and he's just this really nice guy. And if there's a sort of slapstick quality to their being out in the country, they stuff goes wrong all the time, and it's really hilarious at times. But he never loses. He's never angry at anybody except maybe himself for making mistakes, you know. And I think for Cousins and people that are writing this aesthetic, they say, these are the kind of characters that are they're lovable and a little bit odd, and that's what that genealogy is really about. And so for him, he thinks that of course it's positive in this way.
That's fascinating, and I'm glad I've asked because I've actually never made that connection before. So thank you for that. Great answer. I was hoping, I guess, pun intended, if you would humor me, because I have a couple questions about humor today. This is not the subject of your book, and you do not have to answer them, but I am kind of curious, about a couple of things that you mentioned in the first part of your book, which is split self-gesture, speculative sympathy, and imagined comic community. And I was wondering if you would say that we still use all of these in humor today.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. Well, I think I would say that what I call the split self gesture, this idea of self-deprecation, that's not going to go away. And I think that the writers that we're talking about in this aesthetic really lays the foundation for that to be an avenue
Hmm.
for. I mean, you could think of, people. I mean, I think if you look at a lot of stand-up comics, you can see that often they're using self-deprecating humor. I mean, yes, maybe they're often mocking their friends or their family. That's a typical thing. But a lot of times they're telling stories on themselves. Oh my God, I did this, and and that's the kind of thing that you do with your friends, don't you? You go traveling and you come back and and you're telling tales about your travels, and then you inevitably say, "Oh God, and there was this one time we did this," you know, and now and I couldn't laugh at the time, but we can laugh at it now, or maybe you did
Right.
laugh at the time, and so you tell it as a comic story. So that's for sure around, and I think that this aesthetic is something that cemented that as a real possibility. It wasn't like that didn't exist before then. Um, but it's very visible at once the Brits get going with it, and Addison and Steele, and then I think Imagine Comic Community is there. There can be what you sometimes you see. I think is when it's not there, meaning that sometimes you can see a there can be a satire that there's really nobody to like. Um,
Right.
I don't know if you remember the series that's a couple 3 years back or so, whatever it's called, Succession, which was
Right.
about remember this? Okay, I dare you to find anybody that was particularly likable in that story. Almost really nobody is. So there's no community there. Everybody's at each other's throat. Everybody's power hungry and blah blah blah. So sometimes you can see it in a negative way. Well, gee, where's the camaraderie, Or maybe there's a little bit of it somewhere that's there. So if you have, it may be maybe it's the generalization is that in these days, in particular the last 10 years or so, it's harder to find people willing to be genial and laugh with each other. We're so much about mocking each other so often that that's really a lost thing in general. But it implies the opposite, and so maybe it's notable when it actually shows up, or you see a sitcom in which people really are nice to each other. And so I think when you see that as a reader or viewer, you're invited to be that person too, to say, yeah, they're okay. Let's laugh with them. And that's what I mean by that imagined comic community. The speculative sympathy part is maybe not so obvious. I think that's more maybe what happens with some of the characters that I look at. I can't think of something off the top of my head that fits that as well. But I think what you see is certainly for uh, Jeffrey Crayon. I mean, he just sort of, in a way, roams around and looking for the people that are, he can laugh with, and not really, and being sorry almost that he has to laugh at some people or seeing people are misbehaving. There's a set of people they're in a church or a library. I can't remember now off the top of my head which, and they're loud and rude and everything. And he says, what? Why should people can't shouldn't act like this? This is not how we should behave. So there's this, in a way, there's a kind of there's a look at manners, right? And that's certainly what satirists are doing. I mean, William Thackeray is the guy for this in the mid-century. The American writers are, to a certain extent, are following him because he was such a big shot. Once the 40s had finished and he published his Vanity Fair. Here's how you're supposed to behave, and we're going to mock the people that don't. In fact, Vanity Fair there's not a lot of people who like Vanity Fair now that think about it. There's not a whole lot of community in there. There's only a couple, three nice people that are in there for much. But in a sense, he's inviting the reader to go look for the best of us, the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln would say.
I've got one follow-up question for you about this topic, and then I'll ask you the traditional ask question that we ask authors here for our Q&A. And the follow-up question is, would you say that more or less we find the same things funny now that we did then?
To a certain extent, I think when I think about satire, for instance, there are some topics that are perennial. People are vain, they're greedy, you
Mm-hmm.
know, that those sorts of topics, we're gonna, when the satirist, the comic writer holds those people up and those kinds of behaviors up, if your head is screwed on right morally, you're gonna laugh. This is not how we're supposed to be, that sort of thing. But there's probably lots and lots of mm, behaviors that would be tolerated or not tolerated at different time frames. I think that are manners, behaviors that are maybe not quite as obvious. But some things are going to be there all the time. I think, people are rude, let's say, they're, behaving wrong in certain public places, those sorts of behaviors, people are still going to mock that and ridicule it to hopefully, right? That seems to be the bedrock of what we think about as, the legitimacy of ridicule that's not just simply, nasty. If I can
Right.
say it like that. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting. I think there are some there's obviously a difference even between now and maybe sort of like the modernist period. I'm thinking of like the mid 20th century, but like there are some things you'll read and they have this kind of like older quality to them. I'm thinking of like some of the satirical novels by Charles Portis, like Norwood or Gringos even, which kind of has this sort of like wandering, like sort of a rough character who you have sympathy for. Um, yeah, that's
Yeah, that's
uh,
that makes sense. I think that's even if it's not exactly fitting into the sort of literary world that I'm outlining, you get, the idea that you have this person who's sort of a diamond in the rough kind of effect, and maybe he or she is someone who doesn't fit the way things are supposed to be going, and you can, the way that normative behaviors, and so they can be presented easily as kind of an underdog that we can root for. And yeah, they make mistakes. Let's say they're clumsy, but they're still good people. There's a lot of that on the vernacular side in the antebellum period as well. And in fact, part of this project for me was discovering that you had some folks who seemed to be wild and crazy in this sort of a Davy Crockett frontier style, and yet they were these sort of natural gentlemen to a certain extent. And yeah, they could, they might make mistakes, and maybe they don't know how to dance the cotillion, but they're good-hearted, and good citizens. And so we sympathize with them as well. The difference with what I'm talking about is that you have this sort of more highbrow version, if you will, of these characters. You know, these are people who've set themselves forth as gentlemen. You know, it's the sketchbook is written by Jeffrey Crayon, gentleman. You know, and these characters in Hawthorne's character, Miles Coverdale, and certainly Augustine St. Clair, who owns a plantation. He's a gentleman, and in fact has enough money that he looks like a European aristocrat to a certain extent because of he has a plantation and slaves. So that's a different set of people very much, and maybe we're not as interested in them nearly as much anymore, and that's probably a big change to the modern period too. We're more interested in regular folks. You know, that really is a shift that happens a lot later in the 19th century and clearly into the 20th century.
I got one question left for you, Jim. But before I ask it, I want to remind everyone that we have a little link pinned to the chat, which offers a 40% off coupon for this book. So if you haven't gotten it yet and you'd like to pick it up, now's a good time. So check that out. And I'd also like to thank you, Jim, for being here with us today, and also thank everyone for tuning in. So the traditional last question that we have for authors is, now that this book is out, and I'm sure at this point you finished writing it, quite a bit ago, what have you been working on and what's next?
Yeah, for me, this is my family's been listening to me talk about this stuff forever, and the terrible truth is that I'm not done with this topic. It turns out, remember I said that I kept finding all sorts of, more people are writing like this, and the book got too big, and so I took my lady humorist Sarah Willis Parton, Fanny Fern, and she's got her own book now. And then this book is the front end, historically speaking. And then there's these guys in the middle that I haven't finished yet with. So Donald Mitchell is there again. He was quite a force in the early 50s. He had two or three really big popular books almost right up on top of each other. So I'm still interested in him. There's one of the early editors for Harper's magazine. In fact, he was the second big editor, a man named George Curtis, and he has a set of satires also. And they're targeting the upper classes of New York City. So, and it turns out that what's happened in New York City from about 1845 to 1855 is it's boom time. Um, People are moving uptown in Manhattan, building big fancy mansions. Brooklyn is being developed, and so there's an explosion of wealth making. Lots and lots of people are making lots and lots of money, and they want to spend it. There's conspicuous consumption happening in the 1850s. So the next book is still looking at these folks as kinds of comic gentlemen, but their satire is much more caustic. It's much more pointed and sharp than the ones that are in this book now. So it's a focus on New York City. It's a focus on the upper classes in New York City, and it's going to investigate more this idea about we have this range of behaviors with our writers. Got amiable satire and then not so amiable satire, and these guys are the not so amiable bunch. And so that's the focus on that. There'll be some more discussion about gentleman behavior and versus feminine behavior. That's important as well. It turns out there's a whole big thing about dandies and fops and guys who have a ton of money and they dress up and have big mustaches and they look like they look like ladies to a certain extent, or at least that's how some people are teasing them, right, for doing it. And they like to walk up and down Broadway and promenade and stuff. So this whole thing about being masculine or not in your humor and in your satire is embedded in a excuse me is embedded in this social worry about masculinity, which the current book, shows his a very long-standing thing goes all the way back to the 17th century. So it's more of that too. So it's in some ways it's more of the same, but it's also investigates this more outer reaches of Donald Mitchell turns out to be, he's pretty ornery about mocking these rich folks.
That sounds fascinating, and I guess not oddly, it sounds like a kind of American humor that is a lot closer, kind of almost perennial. I mean, if I couldn't name the amount of shows on the top of my head that make fun of sort of rich New Yorkers, whether or the nouveau riche. So that's really exciting. I wanted to also mention before we go a comment from Sabrina Abrams. Thank you for commenting. Sabrina says, thank you for that really interesting and original contribution to transatlantic humor studies. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Sabrina. I'm glad to know that you were there, if you can hear me.
That's all we have for today. Before we go, Jim, is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I just to thank you, Corey, and LSU Press for setting this up. I was telling some other colleagues about this, about you guys as LSU, and just a shout out to James Long as well. I'm just always impressed with all of you on staff and the infrastructure that you put together. So thanks so much for setting this up.
It's our pleasure. And that's all we have for today. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. And until next time.
Okay, thank you.